When my mother died, she left me nothing but a dented tin box of recipe cards that my daughter Jennifer tossed straight into the trash. I fished it out before the sanitation truck came, and hidden behind a card for lemon bars, I found a leather notebook with a single line in my mother's shaky scrawl. It read, "They will try to steal your words. Do not let them." 18 months later, I owned the publishing imprint that had tried to destroy me, and I had my son-in-law's name legally banned from ever appearing in print again. My name is Alina Vance. I am 55 years old, a retired third-grade teacher, and the widow of a firefighter who died inside a burning warehouse 20 years ago, pulling 2 apprentices out before the roof collapsed. He left me a dented Mont Blanc fountain pen he'd bought on our honeymoon and a story I knew the world needed to hear. So I spent my entire teacher's pension, $45,000, and every spare hour of 2 decades writing a memoir of his heroism. I typed nothing digital. I filled 28 spiral notebooks by hand with that pen, the nib wearing down so many times I had it read up twice by a jeweler in Milwaukee. The ink stains on my fingers became a kind of armor. That detail, the permanence of fountain pen ink and its microscopic chemical signature, is the only reason I could prove my own signature was a forgery, and I am going to tell you exactly how I did it. The loss that set everything in motion was not my husband's. That grief had long since become a scar. This was my mother, Lillian, who at 83 still drove herself to church every Sunday and kept a ledger of every cent she ever spent. She lived in the in-law suite attached to my house, and every evening she read aloud from the memoir pages I'd written that day. She was my first reader, my sternest critic, the one who told me to cut 20 pages of backstory about the firehouse politics and get to the heat. When she passed in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in April, I held her hand for the last 2 hours before the coroner arrived, and I did not call anyone else until after they took her away. Within 6 hours of the phone call, my daughter Jennifer and her husband Patrick were standing in my kitchen, dressed like they'd just stepped out of a business casual catalog. Jennifer is my only child, a golden girl who inherited her father's charisma and none of his humility. Patrick is a small press publisher, the kind who talks endlessly about author platforms and film synergies while owing his printer 6 months of invoices. They didn't cry for Lillian. They didn't ask how I was. Patrick immediately mentioned that he'd taken the liberty of opening Mom's safe deposit box at the credit union and that we should consolidate assets to avoid probate confusion. He had a manila folder already prepped with a living trust document, a durable power of attorney, and a medical directive, all of which named him as executor and trustee. I remember noticing that the date stamps on the notary pages were blank, as if he'd just pulled them from a stack he kept in his car. Jennifer was already pulling open kitchen drawers, sorting things into keep and donate piles. She grabbed the old tin recipe box, the one Mom kept on her bedside table, glanced inside and said, "Nobody cooks from cards anymore, Mom," and dropped it into a black garbage bag with coffee grounds and stale bread. The sound it made landing was a hollow clunk, and I filed that away. I said nothing. I had learned decades ago that arguing with Jennifer in front of Patrick always ended with me being described as emotionally fragile. So I let them order takeout and spread legal documents across the dining table. I pretended to be overwhelmed by the medical jargon and the fine print about successor trustees. Patrick kept touching my shoulder and using phrases like, "We just want to protect you from yourself." They stayed until 9, and then Patrick said they had a hotel reservation and would return in the morning to handle the big items. At 2 in the morning, after they'd retreated, I went outside in my robe, untwisted the bag, and pulled out the tin. It was sticky with orange pulp from the old coffee grounds. I wiped it clean with a damp rag, carefully, like I was handling evidence, which it turned out I was. I opened it in my bedroom, under the yellow light of my reading lamp. The cards were sorted by categories: cakes, casseroles, cookies. The lemon bars card was fourth from the front, laminated with yellowed tape, and when I lifted it, I saw that the bottom of the box was not the bottom. The card had been acting as a false floor. Beneath it, nestled in a cut-out rectangle of felt, was a tiny leather memo book, the kind salesmen used in the 1960s. The pages were onion skin thin, filled with Mom's dates and expense notes in blue ballpoint, going back decades. She had recorded everything: the cost of a pound of butter in 1972, the mileage on her car every single fill-up. But the last page, one glued into the binding, was different. It was fresh ink, not ballpoint but gel, and her handwriting was steady. "Patrick is not who he seems. He asked me to convince you to sign over the book. I refused. Protect your story, save yourself." The words hit me like a physical blow. She had written this in the last weeks of her life, probably after a visit I didn't even know they'd had. I could see the faint tremor in the loops of the letters, but the message was firm. I read it 3 times, then I held the notebook against my chest and felt a complete recalibration of my understanding of my own daughter's household. I tucked the notebook into my waistband and went to bed. The next morning, I began to play a role I would not drop for nearly a year. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family loyalty should never be exploited. Now, back to how the trap closed. Jennifer and Patrick came over for breakfast with pastries they'd picked up, the expensive kind from a French bakery, which was designed to make me feel like they were treating me. Patrick laid out a care plan on a laminated presentation folder that had his publishing imprint's logo on the front. He'd even had it spiral bound. Because of my grief-induced confusion, they wanted me to move into their guest house, sell my home, and let Patrick manage the proceeds through his company's fiduciary arm. Jennifer used the word safe 13 times in one conversation. I counted because I had nothing else to do while they talked at me like I was a child. They also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his publishing house was ready to rush my memoir into production, but I'd need to sign a standard representation agreement that afternoon because he had a window with a top literary scout. He said the scout was flying in from New York and needed a clean rights situation within 24 hours. I watched his left eyelid twitch when he said the word scout. It was the thinnest twitch, just a flutter, but I'd seen it before when he lied about the price of a used BMW he'd bought. I did not argue. I said that my memory was foggy, that I couldn't keep track of dates, and that I just needed a few weeks to rest. I let my hand tremble when I lifted my coffee mug. I stared at my oatmeal for 6 seconds before responding to a direct question. Patrick's smile widened. He thought I was broken. I was not broken. I was a woman who had spent 30 years managing 28 fourth graders simultaneously, who had balanced a household budget on a firefighter's salary so tightly we overpaid our mortgage by 13 cents one month, and I noticed that discrepancy in 30 seconds. I knew how to appear harmless while I was cataloging every twitch. They moved me into their guest house, which was really a converted garage with a pull-out sofa and a mini-fridge that hummed so loud I couldn't sleep without earplugs. Jennifer took my house keys for safekeeping and handed me a single key to the guest house, which she said she'd use to check on me. I brought with me 3 suitcases, and inside one, rolled inside a winter coat, were all 28 manuscript notebooks and the tin box. I also brought my Mont Blanc and a fresh bottle of iron gall ink. The first week, I was a model invalid. I shuffled around the main house in slippers, stared at daytime television, and asked the same questions 3 times. I'd wander into the kitchen at odd hours and start opening cabinets, pretending to look for a bowl I'd just used. Patrick would sit at the kitchen island and take frantic phone calls, lowering his voice when I walked past. I'd slow down, let my shuffle be louder to cover my approach, and then I'd pause near the hallway to listen. I heard fragments. Option period, the streamer wants rewrites, no, she hasn't signed the full bundle yet. Another time, he said into his phone, I told you I have the assignment. Yes, signed. Yes, notarized. No, she can't just revoke it, she already signed. He didn't say my name. He said the asset. That word settled into my chest like a cold stone. One afternoon, while Jennifer was at a spin class, Patrick got a call that made him stand up so fast he knocked over a mug of cold coffee. What do you mean the check is contingent on delivery of an uncontested chain of title? I told you I have the assignment. The author is perfectly cooperative. She's just old, she's forgetful. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. No, there's no competing claim, I handled everything. Look, I'll have the original notarized assignment delivered to your legal department by courier tomorrow. Then we can move the option bonus. Perfect. When he hung up, he paced the kitchen, punching at his phone screen. I was in the living room pretending to do a crossword puzzle with a broken pencil. That evening, I accidentally spilled a full pitcher of iced tea across the hallway floor outside his home office. He came running, saw the liquid spreading across the hardwood, and barked at me to get towels. God, Alina, just stay still, don't touch anything, he snapped, his carefully cultivated patience evaporating. I apologized profusely and offered to clean it up. While he was on another call in the kitchen, I sopped up the tea with an armload of paper towels, working slowly, and I noticed the door to his office was ajar. The tea had seeped under the gap, so I had an excuse to push the door open with my hip, still holding wet towels to check for water damage. I stepped inside. His office was a mess of stacked manuscripts and billing statements. Against the wall was a large 4-drawer filing cabinet, one drawer not fully closed, a stack of shredded paper spilling from the top. I stepped closer. The shreds were glossy, the kind that came from a cheap crosscut shredder, not a confetti cut. You could still make out partial words. I scooped up 2 handfuls and stuffed them into the pocket of my cardigan before I backed out and closed the door. That night, in the guest house, I spread the shreds on the pull-out sofa and began to piece them together like a jigsaw puzzle. I used tweezers from my sewing kit and a magnifying glass I'd bought at a pharmacy the day before, paying cash. The first document I reconstructed was a copyright assignment and literary rights transfer agreement. The assignor was listed as Alina Vance. The assignee was Patrick's publishing imprint, Meridian House Books. The signature on the assignor line was a looping cursive that looked, at a casual glance, like mine. But I have spent 40 years writing with a fountain pen that lays down a wet, broad line with subtle shading, because I use iron gall ink, which oxidizes from blue to black over hours and etches into the paper fibers. This signature was written with a gel rollerball, black, uniform, no shading, no fiber penetration. The paper was bright white, not the cream Tomo River paper of my notebooks. The date on the document was 3 months before my mother died, when I was still teaching cursive to a boy named Mateo, and I could prove it with school district payroll records and classroom photos. The next shred pile was even worse. I spent 3 hours reassembling a film option purchase agreement between Meridian House Books and a major streaming service, selling the exclusive rights to my husband's story for $320,000, with a bonus if the project went to series. And attached to it was a ghost-written companion document labeled Authorized Adaptation Outline. It painted me as an unreliable narrator who had fabricated key details of the warehouse fire to bolster my husband's legacy. It used phrases like delusional hagiography and forensic inconsistencies, claiming that the official fire report contradicted my account and that I had exaggerated Tom's role, none of which Patrick had ever mentioned to me. He was not just stealing the rights. He was building a media narrative that would discredit me entirely so I could never sue. I did not call the police. I knew that a forgery allegation with a family member is a civil matter until a prosecutor decides it's criminal, and Patrick would just claim I was a forgetful old woman who signed and forgot. I needed irrefutable forensic proof, so I used my old working-class skills. During my years as a teacher, I had taken a summer job as a transcriptionist for a law firm that specialized in intellectual property. I'd typed depositions in patent cases for 2 summers straight. I knew what a document examiner looked for: pressure patterns, hesitation marks, ink chemistry, paper batch codes. So I took my Mont Blanc and wrote my signature 20 times on a sheet of the same cream paper I used for my manuscripts, varying the speed and angle to establish my natural variation. I photographed everything with my phone, then I hinged a loose floorboard under the guest house bed, wrapped the originals in plastic, and stored them there. Then I searched online for a certified forensic document examiner, someone who had testified in federal court. I found a woman named Moira Calder, a retired forensic scientist from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, living 60 miles north. I called her from a burner phone I bought at a gas station with prepaid minutes, not using the landline or my cell. I described the rollerball signature, the paper discrepancy, and the iron gall ink I used. She asked me if my pen left any telltale signs. I told her how iron gall ink etches the cellulose and darkens with age. She said 3 words that became my lifeline: iron gall ages. She meant that the ink's oxidation continues for decades, and a spectrographic analysis could date a signature within a wide but useful range. If my genuine signatures were years older than the assignment, and the assignment ink was brand new, the forgery would collapse under its own scientific weight. I FedExed her a sample of my writing from a decade-old diary and the photographs I'd taken of the shredded document. While I waited, I kept up my role. I let Patrick think I was docile, letting him bring me forms to review that I'd stare at and set aside. I learned to recognize the sound of his office shredder, a high-pitched grinding that meant he was destroying something he didn't want found. So I began timing the garbage pickup. The night before the truck came, I'd pull his office trash bag from the bin and sift through it in the guest house, reassembling more shreds. It was slow, methodical work, like archaeology. I found bank statements showing his imprints accounts were overdrawn, credit card bills with late fees, a loan application to a high-interest lender that listed my house as collateral without my knowledge. I photographed everything with my phone, backing it up to a cloud account under a false name. One evening, when Patrick and Jennifer had gone to a charity gala, the kind where they'd rent a Tesla and pretend they weren't 3 months behind on their business line of credit, I let myself into the main house using a spare key I'd seen Patrick tuck under a garden gnome near the back door. I had noticed a locked drawer in his desk, a simple wafer lock. I had also noticed, weeks earlier, that his desk was a cheap particle board model and the lock housing was plastic. With a butter knife from the kitchen and a lighter from the guest house, I heated the knife blade until it glowed red, then pushed it into the plastic housing of the drawer lock. The plastic softened and deformed, and I pried it out of its seating. It took less than 3 minutes. I'd learned this from the maintenance man at my old school, who'd once opened a stuck supply closet with a heated screwdriver. Inside the drawer were the originals of the forged documents, plus something far worse, a rubber stamp of my signature, cut from a scanned passport application I had signed at their kitchen table a year earlier. He had taken a high-resolution scan of my genuine signature, cleaned it up in Photoshop, and printed it on a sticky-backed stencil, then traced it with the rollerball to create the original assignment signature. The stamp still had ink residue on the rubber. I photographed it in place with my phone, then I used a piece of Scotch tape to lift a partial fingerprint from the stamp's handle just in case, pressing it onto a white index card and labeling it. I took the stamp and the index card, but left everything else exactly as it was. I walked out, locked the back door, replaced the gnome, and returned to the guest house. Moira's report came back in 10 days by email to a new encrypted address I'd set up. She confirmed that the assignment signature was a mechanical tracing over a reproduced stencil, showing tremor marks and inconsistent speed typical of slow simulation, while my natural writing showed rhythm and fluency. She noted hesitation at the start of each letter, overlapping strokes, and a complete absence of the nib splaying that my fountain pen always produced on the downstroke of the capital E. She also performed thin-layer chromatography on trace ink samples I'd sent from the shredded document and compared them to my iron gall ink. The forgery used a modern dye-based gel that didn't oxidize, while my diary entries showed iron gall that had aged to a brownish-black consistent with 7 to 10 years of oxidation. The paper on the assignment was manufactured in a Swedish mill that didn't produce that batch number until 18 months prior. The assignment was provably fraudulent, but I still needed the legal mechanism to void it instantly, not after a 2-year civil suit during which Patrick could drain my accounts. That's when I discovered my mother's countermeasure. While sorting through the rest of the tin box one evening, I felt another false bottom under the cookie cards. I pried up the cardboard divider and found a small manila envelope containing a brass key and a slip of paper with a bank name, a branch address, and a safe deposit box number. The bank was not the credit union Patrick had raided. It was a small branch of a state-chartered bank near Mom's old church, 30 miles away, a place I'd never been to. The next day, I told Jennifer I was going for a long walk to clear my head, took a bus, then walked the last mile to the bank. With the key and my ID, the teller led me to a vault and I opened the box. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to the U.S. Copyright Office, a receipt for a registered copyright deposit submitted 2 years earlier for the work titled Fireproof, the Thomas Vance story, with me as the sole author and claimant. The registration number was active. The deposit consisted of a complete digital scan of my final manuscript, and the effective date predated Patrick's forgery by 18 months. My mother, without telling me, had taken a flash drive I'd given her with a backup of the memoir, gone to her lawyer, who uploaded it and paid the $85 fee, creating an unassailable public record of my ownership. Attached to the envelope was a letter from Mom in her wavering script. "Eleanor, I know you think I'm just a recipe keeper, But I saw how Patrick looked at your notebooks, like a creditor sizing up collateral. I registered this so no one could claim you weren't the first. Use it if you need to. Love, Mom. I sat in that bank vault on a cold metal stool and cried for 10 full minutes. Then I pressed my palms against my knees, stood up, and got to work. I called the copyright office from the bank's courtesy phone, verified the registration, and asked them to note my contact information. They confirmed that any assignment after that date attempting to transfer rights without my genuine signature was void ab initio, legally meaningless from the start. I had a kill switch. I then contacted an intellectual property attorney recommended by Moira, a woman named Claudia Marchetti, who had represented authors against predatory publishers. I told her the whole story over a 2-hour meeting in her office, bringing the photographs, the rubber stamp, the forensic report, and the copyright registration. She leaned back in her chair and said, "Mrs. Vance, this is one of the cleanest fraud cases I've ever seen. But to make it stick criminally, we need to catch him in the act of attempting to execute the forged contract. I have a friend at the Streaming Services Compliance Department, a man named Landry. He's been suspicious of Meridian House's documentation for weeks. Let me make a call." Claudia arranged a confidential call with Landry. He turned out to be a former SEC investigator who now handled intellectual property due diligence for the streamer's acquisitions. When I described the rubber stamp and the spectrographic ink analysis, he let out a low whistle and said, "The contract we have from Meridian House for the option specifies a guaranteed original signed assignment delivered in person." Patrick keeps stalling, saying the author is ill. I'm going to tell him we need a face-to-face verification with a notary at our legal processing center. We'll frame it as a final bonus requirement. If he brings the forged original and presents it as genuine with you present, that's wire fraud and attempt to pass a forged instrument, right there on camera. Landry also mentioned that the FBI's Intellectual Property Rights Unit was already tracking a series of fraud cases involving small presses, and that the $320,000 threshold made this a priority. He asked if I'd be willing to wear a wire or at least consent to audio recording in the meeting. I said yes. The plan required Patrick to believe he was about to close the deal. Landry called Patrick and explained that the streamer's legal department needed an in-person verification of the author's willingness to participate, and that a final bonus of $50,000 was contingent on my signing a release form in front of a notary at their offices. Patrick was ecstatic. He came into the guest house, beaming, and told me, "Great news, Alina. The publisher wants to meet you. Just a formality, a few signatures, and then we can talk about a nice little annuity for your retirement." He said it like he was handing me a gift. I nodded and said I was grateful. Jennifer actually hugged me for the first time in years and said, "See, Mom, we're taking care of you." Her perfume was cloying. I needed one more thing. I needed to know if Jennifer was salvageable, so I staged a medical scare. That Monday morning, 3 days before the scheduled meeting, I waited until Patrick and Jennifer were both in the kitchen. I walked in, clutching a glass of water, and then I staggered, clutched my chest with a genuine-seeming gasp, and collapsed onto the tile floor, my eyes rolling back. I'd practiced in the mirror, letting my head loll at an unnatural angle. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Jennifer, a scream of Mom. And then, immediately, Patrick's voice, flat and impatient. "Don't call 911 yet. Where's the folder from the office? The assignment originals. If she's having a stroke, we need to secure the documents before EMTs start asking questions. Now, Jennifer, move." I felt his leather-soled shoe step over my shoulder. Not around. Over. His heel actually brushed the fabric of my blouse, right across the seam where my sleeve met the shoulder. He grabbed the leather satchel on the counter, the one containing the forged file, and walked out of the room. Jennifer hesitated. I heard her take 2 steps toward me, then stop, and then she followed him. Her footsteps retreated down the hall. I lay there on the cold tile for 30 seconds, my cheek against the grout, and then I opened my eyes, pushed myself up, and walked back to the guest house. I did not feel sadness. I felt a clean, cold clarity, like the first sip of water after a fever. That was the moment the last filament of family loyalty inside me snapped clean. On the designated Thursday, Patrick drove me to the glass tower downtown that housed the streaming company's legal department. He coached me in the car, his voice a slick, rehearsed patter. "You're going to smile, say yes to whatever they ask, and sign where the little sticky flags are. Don't mention the money. Don't mention Jennifer. Don't mention anything about the process. Just be grateful and cooperative. They're doing us a huge favor, Alina. This could secure your legacy." I nodded and stared out the window, counting the street lamps. In the conference room, Landry was waiting with a notary public, a court reporter with a stenotype machine, and 2 agents from the FBI's Intellectual Property Rights Unit wearing business attire, but with badges visible on their belts. Patrick didn't notice them at first because they were seated against the wall. He spread his papers on the mahogany table, the fraudulent copyright assignment, the film option agreement, a release of liability, and a brand new document he called a voluntary certification of mental competence, which he wanted me to sign to preempt any future claims of incapacity. He set a generic black rollerball pen on top of the paper stack. I picked up the pen. I twirled it once, set it back down, and reached into my purse. I took out my Mont Blanc, the one with the dented cap, and unscrewed it slowly. Everyone at the table watched my hands. I looked directly at Patrick and said, quiet enough that the court reporter had to lean in, "The only signature that will ever appear on my husband's story is the one I wrote myself over 20 years. With this pen, you traced a rubber stamp and called it my name. That's a federal crime." The word crime was the signal. Landry stood and read aloud the copyright registration number, the date of deposit, and the key findings from Moira Calder's forensic report, which he projected on a screen behind him. One of the agents stepped forward and recited the charges. Patrick's face went through 4 colors, a mottled purple-gray. He lunged for the papers, slipping on the polished floor in his Italian loafers, and the other agent caught his arm. The entire thing was recorded by the building's security cameras and the court reporter's transcript. I didn't say another word. The aftermath is not an epilogue. It is a set of consequences, and I want you to understand each one with precision. Patrick Meridian was indicted on 7 federal counts: wire fraud, identity theft, criminal copyright infringement, forgery, and 3 others related to the fraudulent loan applications. He pled out to 3 counts and was sentenced to 42 months in a federal correctional institution, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The court imposed a permanent injunction barring him from any role in publishing, content production, or intellectual property management. The streaming service's escrow fund of $320,000 was seized, and after a restitution hearing, paid directly to me. I then negotiated a new, legitimate option with the same streamer for the true memoir, and they paid me an additional $100,000 for the rights, with the understanding that I had final approval on the adaptation. Jennifer filed for divorce before the sentencing hearing, not out of loyalty to me, but because the asset forfeiture and legal fees left them bankrupt, and she had no way to salvage her lifestyle. She moved to a rental in Arizona and did not contact me. I have not spoken to her since the tile floor, and I do not plan to. I self-published the real memoir under my own independent imprint, using a distributor I contracted directly through a lawyer. The foreword I wrote in 3 sleepless nights detailed every step of the fraud, the forensic evidence, and the legal countermeasures. That foreword was excerpted in a national magazine, and the pre-orders hit 80,000 within a week. By the time the paperback came out, 230,000 copies had sold, earning me $1.2 million in royalties after costs. I put 60% into a charitable trust for families of fallen firefighters. With the remainder, I made a very specific purchase. Meridian House Books, the imprint Patrick had used, was structured as an LLC that had personal guarantees on a line of credit from a specialty lender that financed small presses against projected receivables. When the film deal collapsed and Patrick's fraud became public, the lender accelerated the entire loan and called the personal guarantees. The company defaulted. Its assets, including the ISBN prefixes, distribution contracts, warehouse inventory, and the company name itself, were put up for auction by the bankruptcy trustee. I was the sole bidder. I bought the entire imprint, inclusive of its remaining liabilities, for $67,000. I renamed it Mont Blanc Press. The first official act of the new board, which consisted of me, Claudia Marchetti, and a retired librarian named Mrs. Dolores Prentice, was to amend the Articles of Incorporation to include a perpetual, non-revocable persona non grata clause. Patrick Meridian's name, image, and any work he ever authored or facilitated are permanently banned from any association with the imprint, its catalog, its call-often, or its marketing in perpetuity. There is a letter on file with the state business registry, and there is a framed copy in my office, hung next to the tin recipe box and the lemon bars card. My mother's note now sits in a glass display case alongside the rubber stamp and the spectrograph report. I look at it every morning, and I see not just a warning but a piece of extraordinary foresight. She had no legal training, no forensic knowledge, just a ledger and a lifetime of paying attention. She understood that the only way to fight a betrayer inside the family is with evidence so concrete even blood cannot dilute it. I do not tell this story to celebrate revenge. I tell it because fraud within families relies on silence, on the victim's shame at having trusted, on the exhaustion of fighting people who share your blood. But silence is a solvent that dissolves evidence. Paper lasts. Ink lasts. The right registration number on a government database lasts. And a woman who spends 20 years writing a story about integrity will eventually learn to apply that integrity to herself. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If this story reminded you to protect your own words and your own name, hit like and subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.